Hey everybody, Joe here. Just out tooling around a little bit on the GPX 250 and wanted to make a quick video. I don't know how quick it'll be, but I lost my dad about 4 weeks ago yesterday. And you know, it's funny, it was a surprisingly emotional time for me. It really was. In some ways I struggled with it more than I thought I would, and in some ways less. I guess that's how things like that always are. You never know exactly how. Well, that's so much better. How they're going to affect you. It's September 5th. I tell you what, it is so hot. If you live in the West, you know that right now we're having a huge, just massive heat wave that it's gripping us hard. It's 100 degrees today, much higher than normal, about 15 degrees higher than what we normally have. Anyway, so I lost my dad. And I had some thoughts that I started to develop a little bit in talking at his funeral. And I ended up talking about some things I hadn't really planned on. I ended up actually talking a whole bunch about the duel between the priests of Baal and Elijah. And that's not something I had really intended on. Just kind of happened. Anyway, there was an idea that I had meant to develop, and I didn't have a lot of time to develop it, and I wanted to dive in and see if I could touch on it now, because it's you know, for much of his life, most of his life, the majority of his life, my dad was a little rough around the edges. That's a nice way of putting it. He had a career in law enforcement, but early in his life he ended up being on the wrong side of the law a few times, and you know, it was kind of a troublemaker, and nothing too horrible. He gave a cop a swirly. It was a county sheriff's deputy in Idaho, and you know, of course, the claim is that they didn't know he was a county sheriff's deputy because it was in a dark men's room. They'd turned the lights off to kind of ambush him, and didn't know who he was until he was there. And anyway, that's neither here nor there. He had some interesting things. Actually, literally got whipped by someone who later would be canonized as a saint in the Roman Catholic Church. First one from America to do so. Sister Catherine Drexel. That's a whole nother story. Anyway, he had a rough start, and he had a career in law enforcement, and is often the case, or you know, quite often. That led him to spend lots of time with kind of sometimes unsavory people, and you know, people we would call unsavory, and he became a little rough around the edges. But I wanted to talk about one quality that my dad, even during those rough times, that he always had. My dad didn't judge people by their appearance, or even really by their past, which is astounding for someone in law enforcement. He really didn't. And I want to share just a few things about that and why I think that is so important. So, to give some background, just an idea of how good he was at not doing this. My dad, whoa, big rock there. My dad ended up working at the Utah State Prison, which at the time was in Draper, Utah. And he ended up working there. He had been a county sheriff's deputy, and he'd been a police officer with a local city department before that. He had gotten his degree in sociology and ended up being basically just a prison guard. He wanted it to work into something more than that. It never did. It never came to fruition. But my dad, he became good friends. Not just kind of buddy, you know, whatever, but like a real friend. What in the Irish tradition you would probably call a soul friend, someone who really looks out for you. With several of the inmates there. At one point, that ended up saving his life. That's another story. I might tell that story if there's enough time. It's a pretty cool story. But my dad became friends, and you know, he's one of those guys. He just, you know, talked to people and whatever. And after a while, you know, as a kid, I thought he just knew everybody. That like everyone was his friend, and because he would talk to people he didn't know, strangers he'd meet. He'd start talking to them, and he became close enough with some of the admins there at the prison that after he'd been there a while, they would let him take inmates home, and he would bring them to our house. I was a kid. You know, this is between my years of maybe 8 to 11, 12, and he would bring home inmates for like Sunday dinner, and these were inmates who had, you know, made their way into minimum security type situations, and a lot of them were, you know, within a few years of release. But he would bring them home, and he would treat them very well. He would treat them like you would any other guest that you wanted to have in your home. And I remember one time he brought a guy home. It ended up being the guy who saved his life, actually. And the guy was he was big, he was scary looking, but he was so nice and so thankful and kind and appreciative of, you know, being brought to our house for a nice Sunday dinner. In fact, my dad ended up inviting him over several times. And I remember after a few times, I asked my dad, like, what's he even in prison for? And I remember being impressed that my dad's like, well, that's not mine to share, but I'll ask him if, you know, if he's okay with me sharing that. And then after he'd been to work, you know, the next day, whenever he came home, I was like, yeah, I talked to him, and he's okay with that. And so I'm like, okay, well, what's he in for? It's like, well, he's in for murder. And he had killed 3 men and had just a terrible, extremely rough childhood. In fact, the first person that he'd killed had been his own father. And that was ruled to be, you know, a justified homicide or whatever, but that led him down a terrible, terrible path that, you know, caused him to be incarcerated for most of his life. And anyway, my dad was very good at not judging people. And it wasn't until I was an adult that I came to learn, one, how rare that quality was, and two, how I believe how important that is to God. And wanted to talk just a little bit. Going to go back in history now. My dad loves stories, so I'm going to go way back. You have Joseph and Mary. Go this way. Anyway, who you know, living at the time in Nazareth, and they're engaged. They're betrothed. Now, Nazareth at the time, this is not some place where you like wanted to live. This wasn't like, you know, the desirable. This isn't like the 90210. No, it is on a hill, but it's not. Especially back then. Now, actually, there's 2 parts of Nazareth now if you go there, and the upper part is called Nazareth Elite, and that is actually a pretty nice place to live. But at the time when Joseph and Mary, or Miriam, were living there, the primary people who lived there, the name Nazareth means offshoot, like an offshoot, and they were people from primarily the areas around Jerusalem, which would include Bethlehem. Bethlehem is very close to Jerusalem. It's just a stone's throw away. And they were living there primarily because they couldn't afford to be living in Bethlehem or around Jerusalem. And they were living there because they were working on construction projects in and around Tiberias, which was the Roman capital of that area, the Galilee. And so they were essentially working for the enemy, building those projects. It wasn't that big of a town then either, a few hundred people. And you had the workers who would live there in Nazareth, and after Shabbat, that next morning, Sunday morning, they would leave and they would walk all the way down into Tiberias, and they would work there all week, and then they would leave a few hours before sundown Friday so they could make it back to Nazareth before Shabbat or Sabbath. They would spend Sabbath with their families, and then they would repeat the process. And that's what Joseph was doing. In fact, we have in the King James Version, his occupation is translated as carpenter. But the actual word to describe what he did was tekton. And tekton, that's a Greek word, means builder. It's the same root as architect or tectonic plates. It means builder. And so if you're in England in the 1600s and you're translating the Bible into English, and primarily back then England was quite forested, you had big tracts of forest, and a builder was a carpenter. Most things were built out of wood, other than big churches and whatever, and so that's how that got translated. But I think a more accurate translation to our modern day America would probably be construction worker. Joseph worked construction, and he worked on these building projects in and around Tiberias, again primarily probably for the Romans, because they were the ones building there. And so obviously not wealthy. So you have Joseph and Mary living there, and Joseph and Mary are engaged. And then of course you have the where Joseph and Mary find out separately that she's going to be with child, and that child will be of the Holy Ghost. And it in their world, that this is a society that was highly intolerant of children born out of wedlock, and people who became pregnant out of wedlock. In fact, Joseph had the right, had he chosen, he could have had Mary stoned. Of course, that doesn't have anything to do with drugs. It means that she would be cast into a pit where people would stand up above her, a little above the height of her head, and throw stones, just a little bigger than these ones I'm riding over, or around that. Stones the size of, say, a baseball to a cantaloupe. They would throw those at her until she was dead. And a very violent way to die. And Joseph would have been fully in his rights to have done that to Mary, even if secretly he was the father. And so it was a society that was very intolerant of that. So you have prophets like Isaiah, who saw the life of Jesus, who saw Christ's life. And I love in Isaiah 53, he is describing Jesus, and he says, oh look, fun. How fun. Love writing in the evening, especially days like today where it's 100 degrees during the day. But Isaiah said, he is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He is despised, and we received him not. And he obviously he's talking about toward the end of Jesus's life, when his own people that he'd come to save would choose to crucify him over Barabbas, and to let Barabbas go. But also I really believe he was talking about the beginning of Jesus's life too. From the beginning, Jesus was kind of an outcast among his own people. Certainly, we know that his own king, Herod, tried to have him killed, and that his parents had to flee to another country. So he really was, in describing Joseph, immigrant construction worker might not be a bad way to describe him. And I'm just going to turn that off for a second. Anyway, immigrant construction worker might not be a bad way to describe him, because that really is more, what he was, and especially when they had to flee to Egypt. So Jesus knew what it was like to not fit in, and I love the description. Isaiah is so descriptive. He said, "And we hid, as it were, our faces from him." I love that. That just takes me right back to junior high. I was the biggest nerd in junior high. I was just the scrawniest little kid. I sucked at sports. I had ADD, hadn't remotely figured out how to control my own brain. I was failing most of my classes nearly all the time. It was the norm for me to fail classes. I remember I remember from 8th grade, my GPA started with a 0.958. I remember that to this day. I was so embarrassed. And the only reason it was that high was because of classes like arts, crafts, and PE. Anyway, but I remember being nerdy enough that I would walk down the hallway, and some kids that I knew, like I knew from elementary school, or we'd been friends before, they would see me and they would kind of turn their head from me, pretend like they didn't know me, didn't recognize me, and I remember that. I remember them kind of hiding their faces from me and pretending they didn't know me, and so I love that description that Isaiah gives, that we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He's someone that they shunned, and you look at Joseph and Mary. They traveled to Bethlehem, and there's no room for them in the inn. Why are they even looking in the inns? They're from there. This is during the Second Temple period. You have about 300 people that lived in Bethlehem. Why aren't they staying with family? Well, let's see. Mary is pregnant with what they see as an illegitimate child, and is about to give birth. And most scholars believe that this census, this taxing and census, would have been done in sync with one of the large festivals where people naturally gathered to Jerusalem. So you have Pesach, or Passover, and then you have the Feast of the Tabernacles. And either way, do we really want them in the house at Christmas? And I'm not saying that's what happened, but gosh, I think it's likely. I think it's quite probable that's what happened. And so you have Jesus, who is shunned quite literally, from his arrival, and then you have him as an adult. What did it say? It's in Matthew chapter 8. It said, "The foxes have holes and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man hath not where to lay his head." I think in the New English translation, it's "the foxes have dens and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has not a place to put his head." I think that's how they word it there, something like that. I usually read King James. But either way, it paints the correct picture that Jesus is essentially homeless for a great deal of his life, and certainly during the period of his ministry, and he's definitely shunned by his family, at least initially. And I hesitate to share this because it's kind of sacred, but I will, because I want to, and I feel like there are people who would like to hear it, maybe not. But I've had the chance to go to Israel several times. I've just been really lucky, for reals. I lucked out. I ended up guiding some tours for a company that does tours to Israel, just because I like old things and languages and different. I like to read things. And anyway, I have a friend there who's from that area, and his wife is actually from Bethlehem, and you can go. There's you can go down. Sorry, my mind's completely going blank. But underneath the Church of the Nativity, there we go. You can go down into the grotto, and there's a cave where some people believe that's the actual place where Jesus was born. Other people don't. I don't know if Constantine's mother-in-law got it right or not when she went down to determine such things, but it's very ornate now. There's there's tiling on the floor, and there are tapestries hanging on the walls, and incense burning, and there's religious iconography all around. And we had gone there, and I asked my friend, are there caves that are still being used? So Jerusalem and Bethlehem, there are natural cavities or caves that are all over the place. You have a lot of limestone and other soft rock deposits, and so there are lots of caves. And he's like, oh yeah. I'm like, well, can we go in one? And this, I've got a tour bus of 50 people. I was like, yeah, we could make that work. And so we did that. We went down into the shepherd's fields, and we found a cave, and we went down in there. And if that's anything like where Jesus was born, it gave me a complete new appreciation for what I would call the condescension of God coming down and becoming human. There are fresh droppings, of course, which smell. But then underneath the fresh droppings, there's probably a foot of, it's very dry there, of course, in Israel, and there's probably a foot of just dried out, powdered fecal matter from the sheep. And so when you step, each step there's like a plume of this that pops up, and I took a bus down, or bus group. You can of course take a bus down, but one at a time we made our way down through the opening, and this was what they would use. The shepherds would herd the sheep down into one of these caverns at night, and then they could just have one or two boys that could watch the entrance and not have to worry about the sheep wandering off or being killed or hurt. And so we all got down there, and it's surreal to think of someone giving birth there. I've been present for the birth of three of my children, and it's surreal to think of that happening in a place like that. Anyway, sorry, I'm getting way off target. My point is, when Jesus talks in Matthew 25, he says that inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these my brothers, ye have done it unto me. I think he means two things by that, and primarily he means that he loves. You've maybe heard the saying, you'll never look into the eyes of someone that God doesn't love. He loves all of his children. So when we hurt them, or when we help them or bless them, we are hurting or helping or blessing him, because he cares about them. But I also think it means that when he came down, he was one of the least. He was one of the least. He was an outsider. And if you've ever felt like that, if you're like me, and maybe when you're in junior high, maybe you're still in junior high, and you're that kid that you walk down the hallways, and people that you used to be good friends with in 5th grade, pretend not to see you, or don't look at you, or maybe as an adult you even have some things like that. Some family that won't recognize you, or pretends you don't exist, and that I can testify, you have a Savior that knows what that feels like. And if you don't believe that, read Isaiah 53, because Isaiah saw his life and describes it beautifully, that he was despised, he was rejected, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Like he knows what that feels like, and is therefore filled with compassion for us when we feel that way. And that's really my message. Now, just for fun, I'll share two things about my dad, because they're fun, and I miss my dad, and he loves stories. So the first one is just a funny little thing about him. I mentioned that he didn't look down on people. Like, he really didn't. Whether you were a CEO of a company or the garbage man, he would treat you the same. He would look at you and smile, and and ask how you were doing or whatever. And I remember as a kid, days when he was off, when the garbage men came, like especially during the summer when it was hot. If he happened to be home from work, I knew he would be home from work like the night before. He would put a 6-pack of Coke in the fridge, so it was nice and cold. And when he'd hear the garbage truck coming down our little street, he would jump up from wherever he was, what he was doing. He'd run to the fridge, he'd grab that, and he would run out and give the garbage men a 6-pack of Coke, and thank them for being out working on such a hot day. And I remember him doing that, and garbage bin. Like this is before they had the cool machines that just lift it and dump it. This is back when you had like a driver, and then you'd have two guys at the back that like throw all the garbage into the garbage truck into the back. And anyway, he would run out and he would do that, and I remember being impressed whenever I'd see that and thinking, he cares about that. And then just to follow up that story, so the inmate that there were a couple that he brought, but this one to the house when he worked at the prison. But this one he'd brought several times. In fact, at one point this inmate ended up getting released just right before Christmas, and my dad invited him to our house for like Christmas and Christmas Eve and stuff, and thought that was really cool. But he was a big guy. He was like muscular, probably close to 300 pounds, and this is back a long time ago, so I'm sure the verbiage has changed, but back then he was what was considered a heavy, meaning like he kind of ruled his cell block. If you wanted to run some kind of operation in that cell block, you had to run it by him, and if you didn't, then you would end up, getting beat up or hurt, or, have a sheet tied around your neck and thrown over a balcony, and, something like that. Something bad would happen to you. And so my dad's working at the prison, and it's after his shift, and he's actually in one of the shops. I think it was the wood shop or something, and he was going to do like a wood shop project for Christmas, because he never had a lot of money. And that he found out from his radio that 2 inmates weren't accounted for, and it was believed that they were trying to escape. And he's like, oh crap, like he's unarmed, and in come running these 2 inmates, and one of them has a shiv, and my dad's completely unarmed, and he's got these 2 guys, and they're debating what to do. Like, do we kill the guard, or do we just tie him up or something? What's our best plan of action here? And they were leaning towards killing him. And out of nowhere, there's a big steel door to that area, and there's just this huge, loud, crashing boom sound, and the door just swings open and like bangs into the wall, and big, huge metallic ringing sound, and this inmate that my dad had befriended is standing in the doorway. And my dad's thinking, okay, this situation either just got better or worse, like I really don't know which. And he looks at all 3 of them, and then he looks at the 2 inmates, and he just says, whatever you do to him, you do to me. I love that. Whatever you do to him, you do to me. Almost like a prison version of, inasmuch as you have done it unto the least of these my brethren, you've done it unto me, because prisoners generally don't care for guards. And then he just turns around and walks out and leaves. And my dad's like, what? He's just going to leave me? And the 2 inmates look at each other for about 5-10 seconds. They drop the shiv and, basically get down on their knees and turn themselves and give themselves up to my dad. My dad had told me that story, and it was wild enough that I thought, I don't know that really happened. Like, I don't know, like, my dad really does love stories. Like, could he be embellishing this one? Years later, I'm at a church-sponsored activity thing, and we're all sitting around a fire, and I end up working with some of the young men in the church in that group and whatever, and I end up telling that story. And one of them had heard the story before, and they asked, so I ended up telling it. Anyway, I told that story, and one of the people there in the congregation or whatever, an older man, he's like, some of the people like kind of didn't believe, like, I don't know about that. That sounds pretty wild. And he just nods. He's like, I can tell you for a fact that happened. I can tell you for a fact that happened because I've heard that story before, and I know exactly who that was. And he said the name of the inmate. I won't, because I don't know if he's still alive. But he said the name of the inmate that had like stepped in to help my dad, and and I'm like, wow, like, were you a guard at the prison? He's like, nope, I was a resident for a while. And I'm like, oh. I'm like, well, how did you hear this story? He's like, from one of the guys trying to escape. So he had heard it from the other side, and he said that's exactly how the guy told the story. That, like, they were there, they had the shiv, they're like, do we kill him? What do we do with this guy? And all of a sudden this guy, I don't use his name, just kicks open the door and looks at him, basically like they're pond scum kind of thing, and puts the fear of God into them and then just says, whatever you do to him, you do to me, and walks away. And they're like, crap, like, yeah, if we don't make it out, we're dead, so we're done. And they gave up. And anyway, I just thought that was a funny story. I'm not saying that karma always works or anything, but it sure worked for my dad that time. But the main thought that I guess I wanted to share is just, I think God really does care about how we view each other. And I know there's a lot of division right now in our country on virtually everything, whether you're in the U.S. or Canada or Europe. I've lived in Europe for a while and have friends there, and I know that a lot of Europe is experiencing the same division and the same economic hardship that we are. And as we go through that, just remember, you'll never look into the eyes of someone God doesn't love. And you might disagree with them about virtually everything, but they're your brother, your sister, and God still loves them. And try and be gentle. Try and, in Proverbs 15, it says, a soft answer turneth away wrath, but grievous words stir up anger. And, we don't need to stir up more anger. There are enough politicians doing that for us, trying to pit us against each other and trying to get us to see the other side as mortal enemies instead of people we just disagree with. And I just want to let you know that, like, how we treat people matters, and how we see other people matters, not just to us, but it matters to God, because he sees them and he loves them. Like, they're his kids, and he loves them. And even when they do terrible things, if you have kids, you know what I'm talking about. One of your kids could do the stupidest thing, and you just think, how could you do that? That's, going to cause me so much work, so much harm, or that's so detrimental to you or to your brother or sister. But you don't stop loving them. You still love them, and God loves us that way. And that's all I wanted to talk about. This video is probably too long, and I should head back before it's all the way dark. Love y'all. Have a great day.